Okay.
So I think to start off with, 'cause this is our first time chatting, and we've not met
Yeah.
in real life ever. Probably just a good idea to find out a little bit about one another. So,
Yeah.
how about you? What's your background? Where are you from, and how did you come to be
Yeah.
writing for a
So
living?
I'm Swansea born and bred. Pretty much the classic sort of young lad in school dreaming to become a footballer or cricketer and that sort of thing. And I do a lot of schools work as well. I'm sure you go in as well. And my tale is very much the one about the kid that I played in quite successful school teams and club teams as a youngster. And that probably gave me a bigger sense of my ability than my ability really was. So
Right.
we would win lots of games and win cups and trophies and so on. And then you kind of get to 16 with this sort of dream in your background. Maybe I could be a footballer.
Mhm.
Not that I probably ever was going to be one. But then you realize, well, actually, I should have concentrated more on my schoolwork, which I didn't. So I'm the classic tale, really, of the kid just being so obsessed with sport and not really concentrating on the important things. But ironically, the one thing that I loved doing from probably the age of 8 or 9 was reading. And that's the thing, ultimately, 20, 30 years later, whatever it was, that was the pathway to becoming a writer. So, I mean, when I was 18, I sort of flunked my sixth form aspirations as well. Just got a job in the local council without any plan at all. But through all that time, I was still reading about sport and anything really, magazines, newspapers, comics, autobiographies, lots of obviously factual stuff. And what I didn't realize was when I got to, I think it was 40 when I started it, my first book was an autobiography of a local Glamorgan cricketer and played football for Swansea City. And really, in conversation with him, his name is Tommy Cotty, in conversation with him, we realized that it was almost like the 25 years of reading had given me an ability to write that I didn't really know I had. So I wasn't one of those people that thought one day I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to, it's something I want to do forever. It was very much the reading gave me the ability, I think. And since then, I've hardly stopped. So I've written for magazines, newspapers. Initially, I thought my change of career could have led me to be some sort of sports journalist. That's kind of what I thought after the first book. But then I started being asked to go into schools to link my story about reading, about sport, and how I became a sports writer to young people. And that's when teachers would say, "Oh, you wouldn't like to write a story about sport, would you? That's something that, seems to be a little missing link for us."
Mm.
And that gave me that idea then. So I suppose I'm, half children's writer now, half sports sort of biographer, whatever you want to call it. But largely based on everything I've grown up around sports fields, competitions, playing sport in Swansea, really.
Terrific. Okay. Oh, so sport was a very sort of big component of your school life growing up. Then you had lots of opportunities
Yeah.
to
Oh,
participate.
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And as I said, when you're young, I think you have dreams, and maybe those dreams aren't based in full reality at the time.
Mm.
But the one thing I was always laughed at really in school, because along with my love of playing sport, I was what we call a stato. So I would love to read about, if the FA Cup final was on next week. I've got a few of the books here. This would be a book that I would have read probably as a 9, 10-year-old, when this
Oh,
book
okay.
was designed to be, it's a big old thick book, but it was designed for sports journalists to have,
Mhm.
obviously no internet, and it had details of every sports football club in the UK, the players, the records. And I would read this religiously to learn silly facts, names of, where football clubs played, who their all-time greatest scorer was, stuff like that.
Mhm.
And in adult life, I've become a bit of a quizzer, that sort of thing. So I've always enjoyed the factual knowledge of sport alongside playing it. But then the way it worked for me anyway was that led me in then to the story of people. So, why did somebody play 10 years for Manchester United when they were born in Newcastle, for example? So I'd try and work out that part of the story as well.
Yeah.
And that led me then to really enjoying autobiographies and ended up writing those as well. So, yeah, sport, honestly, without it, I really wonder what I might have done in life, really. But to be, and I noticed, I read something about you the other day about your joy in becoming a full-time author.
Mm.
And that's exactly the same for me. I now, I'm blessed with sort of part of my job is going into schools, which I talk about sport, talk about books, talk about reading and writing. And the other part of my job is writing about sport and doing the research about sport that I get paid for as well. So it took a long time, but I'm now doing something that I absolutely love and adore, So, and I guess the story, same for yourself.
Similar. I get the impression that our childhoods were sort of diametrically opposite in terms of interest, because my relationship with sport has always been how best to avoid it, which I've managed quite successfully, because sport in school was football. All of the boys, every break time, every lunchtime, played football, and PE was just football every week for years and years and years. And if you weren't any good at football, tough. That was it. And I've never been any good at football. Yeah. So I sort of very quickly grew to quite resent it, to be honest, and just not want to participate at all. So I've never had any interest in it since. Yeah. I don't think I've ever watched a football match all the way through. I was quite a swimmer when I was young. Individual sports. I've never been into team sports particularly, but I loved swimming. But other than that, no. Like we did for about 6 weeks of every year when we were in secondary school, we did rugby. We were allowed to change from the football. Wasn't much better at that either, to be honest. So very quickly learned the best ways to bunk off PE and just sort of mooch around the school or around the housing estate. Yeah, next to the playing fields and things. So no, I've never really had any knowledge of, or I've never been plugged into that part of the culture, which and it's such a big part of British culture as well. It's particularly when you're a boy growing up, it's such a massive thing. I always felt that I was missing out somewhat. Yeah. But so slightly odd. But I like you, I've always been a reader. For as long as I can remember, I've loved reading all sorts of stories, particularly fantasy. It started with Enid Blyton's The Magic Faraway Tree, which was read to me as a bedtime story when I was about 3. And I've never looked back really. I just kept going. And then when I was about 8 or 9, it suddenly occurred to me that these books I loved reading were written by actual people who liked stories, and that I could actually maybe tell my own as opposed to just reading other people's. And that's what I've been trying to do ever since. And it took me 25, 26 years or so, but at last I finally made it as a full-time author, which is fantastic. I actually get to tell the stories that I'd like to read that nobody else has written yet. So
absolutely. And I think the link between the pair of us, really, it's almost like the subject matter doesn't matter. It's the passion that we have about a certain part of our life that we're lucky enough now to write about. That's it. And when I go into schools, obviously if I got a class of 30 young people, then I'd be ridiculous to think that they all like sport and they're all going to hang on every word that I'm going to talk about because I love sport. So what I try to get them to think about is that if I can demonstrate my passion to them for my thing, which just happens to be sport, so I write children's books or write grown-up books about it, then whatever your passion is, think about that and think you could do the same, but whatever field it is. And then I would talk about authors like yourself and other authors that have a totally different genre. But generally, every author I've met, they don't write about things that they don't like. They have found their passion, and whether they therefore become, Stephen King and write just purely for adults, for example, or like us, we write for younger audiences, it kind of doesn't matter. If you can just demonstrate the passion you have, deliver that either in person, as we're chatting about it now, or obviously on the page, then I think you engage with all of your audience, the younger audience. And I'd be delighted to think that some young people I've spoken to would take up writing and then never write a word about sport. But maybe they saw that was my passion. They then find theirs and off you go. So, and I think that's why it is so important that, genres have been around obviously for hundreds of years, but it is so important that children have an absolutely wide variety of books to choose from, that they can just dip in and dip out and think, oh yeah, didn't like that, but I like that, and carry on,
Yeah.
So,
I agree, absolutely. And it's really interesting that you mentioned that somebody suggested to you that you should write a sports book for children because there was a gap in the market, so to speak. And it's occurred to me that I don't think I'd ever read, non-fiction sports books for children. I know there are some out there, but in terms of actual sports themed fiction for children, I don't think I'd ever seen one really, but before I came across your books. So so how did you find moving into that field? How did you approach the jump from non-fiction and biography to actual children's literature?
Yeah, I kind of thought that it had been a recurring thing with many schools saying, "Oh, have you written?" They almost used to say, "Have you written proper books?" And I used to get a little bit annoyed at the start. Think, hang on a minute, they're life stories. They're not made up, obviously. But then I realised this is becoming a theme. So I did a bit of research, went away, and every time I went into a school then, and for about a year, I did some consultancy work with the National Literacy Trust and their Premier League reading stars in Wales. So I basically was involved in basically helping rewrite the programme for the Welsh audience, if you like, training teachers and then going into schools as an author as part of the scheme. And whenever I'd go in, I would ask if I could have a quick look at the library. And as you just said, the only sports books that would be in the library generally, I am generalising, were, sort of Gareth Edwards rugby tips, 1979 and stuff like this, and the history of the Olympics. Now, don't get me wrong, I would have read them, right? I'm a stato, so I would have read them. But I kind of thought, well, where are the stories? Where are the sporting stories? Almost like if you can write Harry Potter in a wizardry background, then you could write a story of another character in a sporting background. And that was it, really. I was always going to write one about a younger person who was probably a little bit misguided as a youth, because that was probably where I was, and always have them sort of being put on a new line, if you like, by a mentor character, because I'd had quite a few mentors playing football. But then I kind of thought, well, football is everywhere. Maybe I need to go to a different subject matter. So that's when I basically did it on cycling with Champion of Champions. And I guess it could be a risk to some people because cycling isn't sort of mainstream. But when I started writing it, it was on the back of the Olympics 2012, Bradley Wiggins doing well, Chris Froome winning the Tour de France. So all of a sudden there was this drive for cycling to be more of an interesting sport, if you like. And that was it, really. And I just thought, right, what do I want to do in this book? I want to inspire young people. I want to entertain them. I want to hopefully give them an idea that, look, if things aren't going quite right in your life at the moment, that's fine. It happens to us all. But maybe pick something that will inspire you to be the best you can be, which is the tenet of the book, really. But then I had this other idea about telling a true story within the story. So there's a guy, I don't know if it'll come through on here. This guy here is Fausto Coppi. So he was an Italian cyclist back in the 1950s, and I thought it would be nice to retell his life story for a younger audience. So it was kind of like a book of two stories. The story of the fictional Daniel, who was probably a little bit loosely based on me growing up, but then how Daniel was inspired to become potentially a professional cyclist by being told the story of Fausto Coppi by his grandfather, who was the mentor figure. And once that was in my head, once I understood how it was going to be, because that's the nuts and bolts of the story, then I found it flowed quite quickly then. But the funny thing was, this was my fifth book, but I could hardly get a publisher because publishers only saw me as a sports biographer.
Right.
So, yeah, even though I had credit with my previous publishers, with books that I'd written and had done well, they didn't want to know, even though they liked the book. And one of them, I won't tell you who it was, that I kept the email just for one day, you never know. And they said, look, we love the book, we love the story, but we can't sell you. And then you've got to realize, wow, yeah, and to be honest, they were honest. I can't fault them for sitting
personal.
on the fence. Yeah. But I think, again, you know what the writing world is like. It's so competitive, it's so difficult to get even through the door of the publisher in the first place, let alone getting to read it. But I stuck with it, and I don't know if you've heard of an author called Tom Palmer. Tom is an author from Leeds. Tom's written 40-odd books now.
I recognise the name.
Yeah, and by a massive quirk of fate, I was in a school in Swansea, Seaview School in Mayhill, and I was doing something on writing a sports story, and my phone pinged, and it was Tom Palmer on Twitter, who I follow, was doing a little kind of afternoon quiz about if somebody can answer this question about rugby league, then they might get into my next book or something like that. And then at lunchtime, I sort of answered, and I said, look, I'm in a class later on. And he said, oh, well, ask them the question. So we kind of, it wasn't a video link like this, but we kind of had tweets back and forth.
Yeah.
And then I got to meet Tom. All this took over about a year. And then we really became like, gosh, we've got the same ideas, same background. And Tom became a big inspiration then in sticking with it and going for these books, you know, about sport. And I'm delighted to say Tom and I are still great mates, you know. So, and it's nice then to have a person that you can, which is what I did. Then I sent Tom the draft of this, and he read it, and he's very complimentary. And he said, it's got to be published. He then, because I still couldn't get it published, he put me in touch with his first publisher, quite a small publisher in Leeds, and they read it and agreed to publish it. So again, without that little bit of luck, this book, To the Champion of the Challenge, probably wouldn't have happened. So I don't know, what was your experience getting your first books published?
It all happened very suddenly, and like you, it was a certain amount of luck and almost accidental, really. I'd spent years writing dark fantasy and thrillers and horror and things. I was sure that I wanted to be an adult writer, you know, terribly, not quite Stephen King, but, you know, in that sort of direction, because that's the sort of stuff that I loved reading. And I'd been doing it for years and years, and I'd got some short stories published here and there, and I'd had flickers of interest from various people, but nothing serious. And then about 8-9 years ago, I became a father for the first time. When my son was about 4 or 5 years old, every night I'd read to him at bedtime, and we'd have a bedtime story together, which is always one of my favourite times of the day when I was a kid. Favourite time of the day again now that I'm reading to him. And I remember one night, I've already mentioned The Magic Faraway Tree by Enid Blyton. It was the first story that I can remember as a bedtime story when I was young. So we bought a nice new copy for my son, and I read it to him, and he really enjoyed it. And we went on, we read some of my favourite Roald Dahls and a couple of Dr. Seuss's and things like that. And I was about to reach for a new Roald Dahl book one night, and he held up his hand and he said, "No, Dad, I don't want that story tonight. I want a brand new story that no one's ever heard before." So I had to make up something on the spot. And basically, I just sort of, in a bit of a panic, threw together a load of ingredients from the sort of stories that I'd really, really enjoyed as a child and that I thought he would enjoy. And it was all about a girl who gets whisked away on a magical train, traveling from one magical world to another. And it's a postal train, and she's given a magical object to deliver. And it's all about her adventures delivering this parcel and things that go wrong. And I told him this story over the course of 3 or 4 nights, and had good fun telling it. And then sort of we moved on to other books, but the story stuck around in my head, and I kept going back to it and thinking, if I told it again now, I'd change that bit there, and I'd add a character here, and I've just thought of a really good joke I wish I'd included. And after about a year, I thought I'd got to the end of writing yet another sort of gritty thriller with a sort of fantasy element. Because I've always read fantasy, I've loved fantasy, and I thought, well, I'll try and inject a bit of fantasy into my sort of gritty, real world, terribly important novel and see if that works. And the fantasy stuff was the most fun.
Right.
And that's when it really came alive. And I thought, well, I'll tell you what, this book hasn't worked. I'll try writing that bedtime story that I told my son. And it all just sort of came rolling out in one big go over the course of about literally exactly 100 days. I wrote the whole thing start to finish. Wow. Which is the quickest I've ever written anything. I'll never be that fast again. But I'd had a year to think about it, and it was all there and mapped out in my head. And I showed it to a friend of mine, Claire Fayers, who's taken part in this online festival. And Claire and I have known each other for 15 years before either of us was published, and we've always shared first drafts back and forth, and we've given each other notes. And I showed this to her and said, "Look, I've written to my own surprise, I've written a children's book. I think it's good. It was a lot of fun to write, but you're the children's author. Can you take a look at it and tell me what you think?" And she sort of read it and got back to me and said, "Well, I really enjoyed this. I'm meeting my agent for lunch next week. I know she's looking for new stuff. Would you mind if I showed it to her?
Yeah.
So I said, oh, yeah, yes, please, thinking that nothing would come of it because it's hard to get an agent. I mean, agents are very busy. They're overbooked. They don't take an awful lot of stuff. So I sent it off thinking, well, maybe I'll get some useful feedback, if nothing else. But the agent liked it and offered to represent me. So she's Gemma Cooper, and she's been my agent for 3 years now. And within about 6 months, we had the book deal all sorted. It was remarkably quick. It all happened very, very fast indeed.
I don't know if you're the same as me as well. I mean, I just had a normal life. So, I worked for the local government in Swansea. I loved my time there. It was great, but it was something missing that I don't know. It's hard to explain, but you just felt, is this it, sort of thing, without being rude to anyone that works there. It's not about that. But then when the first book happened, not Champion of Champions, the first autobiography I did, that moment when the book or the box comes and you get your 15 copies and you open the box and there's this thing with your name on, it's a priceless moment, isn't it? And I really try and share the joy of that when I go into schools, because I think there's a danger sometimes, and I've never met any, but I suppose authors might take themselves a bit too seriously and so on. And maybe if I'd been an author, out of the blocks at 21, perhaps I'd been like that. But because I'd lived this life, the normal life that I had, the mortgage, the 2 cars, all of this stuff, and then the writing came later on, it was almost like a gift in a way. And that's how I try to get young people. And I do say to them, don't waste the 20 odd years that I wasted. Start straight away.
Yes.
But, yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. No, I'd worked odd jobs, full-time and part-time here and there for 20 years. So it was, the writing was always squeezed in around the edges of that.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So in terms of, because this is what I'm interested in, my next project, if you like, is I've written 2 children's books with James Hook, the Wales rugby player. They're called Chasing the Rugby Dream. And we've got a 2-book deal. So book 1 is done, ready to be printed literally this week.
That's kickoff, isn't it?
Yeah, that's kickoff, yeah. So that's going to be, it was supposed to come out in June. Obviously, coronavirus saw at the end of that. So the publisher decided to push it back to October. And then book 2 is finished, but it's now the editing process. And that'll probably come out next sort of March, April time. Right. Now, James and I have planned ahead for book 3, book 4. We've sat down and we've only just outlined, what's going to happen with our characters. But I didn't really, when we first started doing it, we didn't know whether we would get a series or whether it would be a one-off. So the kind of the series part has kind of happened after book 1 is finished, if that makes sense. So what about yourself? Because I know that there's 2 in your series done. I think the 3rd is due to come out. Is that right?
That's right. I handed in basically the final draft of the 3rd book about a week ago now. Right. So it was due out in October this year, but with coronavirus and everything else, we're waiting to see what happens. It might get pushed back to the spring of 2021. But yes, no, it's I had a 3-book deal sort of straight out of the blocks. It was sold. Even though the first one was already written, it was sold as a 3-book deal.
So from book 1, then you knew. Sorry, so from book 1, you knew that you would be delivering a series from that point.
By the time it came to actually getting the publishing deal, yes. When I sat down to write it, I had no idea at all. No, wasn't even sure I was going to be able to get to the end of writing book 1 because I'd never tried to write anything like this before. It was a big experiment, really. But by the time I got to the end of writing that first book, I had grown to love the characters and the situation so much with Susie, my heroine, and this crew of trolls on this train. I knew that there was more I could do with them, and I wanted them to go on another adventure. I didn't know what it was going to look like yet, but I deliberately left the ending of the first one slightly open so that I could come back and do more if the opportunity arose. And again, at this point, I still didn't have any real firm idea that it was ever going to be a published book, but I thought, well, if only for my own amusement and for my son, I can write it for him, so he can have adventures to read in a couple of years' time. So when my agent started shopping the first book around publishers, she said she wanted to sell it as a 3-book deal, because that was what a lot of publishers were looking for at the time,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in middle grade, which is that sort of 8 to 12-year-old age
Yeah.
range where the book sits in.
Yeah.
So I had to come up with some sort of fairly brief synopses for books 2 and 3, nothing too firm, just to show that I did have actual ideas of where I could take it next. And the books that I've ended up writing are like passingly similar to those synopses. They've changed a lot
Yeah.
in the actual telling. Particularly book 2. Book 2's changed most of all, I think. But yeah, so I knew from the moment that I'd signed the contract that there were two more to come.
Brilliant. God, I guess that's like a two-way street, isn't it? It's the sort of delight of knowing that whatever happens, you're going to have 3 books. But then there's the pressure, then, isn't there, of knowing, God, I've got to get these right as well.
I actually got to deliver them now.
Yeah.
But no, it's been wonderful. And whenever I've run into trouble, my editors have been really supportive and very patient, and they've helped me through it. And
brilliant.
Particularly, we're trying to get book 3 finished in the lockdown with kids at home all the time as well. They appreciate that everything is running a bit more slowly than it normally would. But we're finally there, and it's a very odd feeling to have got to the end of of this series, to be sort of moving on to something different.
Well, it's funny because when James Hook and I got together, I didn't know James at all, and we had a mutual friend. And James had been to a book fair in his son's school when he was playing rugby in Gloucester a few years ago. And basically said to his son, look, let's go and get some books. And there were no storybooks about sport, as we just mentioned earlier on. So it always stuck in James's mind about, a lot of sports people, I think, when they come towards the end of their career, they're looking straight for the autobiography and just that sort of closes things down and they move on. But James wanted to think about potentially having a children's storybook about sport. So I won't bore you with the whole thing, but because our mutual friend Mal had read this, and obviously Swansea being just a big village really, he put us both in touch. And what was nice for me, and there's a question at the end of this for you, but what was nice for me was that before I wrote a word really in book 1, James and I don't know how many meetings we must have had, because we got on like house on fire from day 1, which from my point of view is a delight to be working with someone you get on with. But it was very much picking his brains about not just his rugby career at the highest end of sport, but his own experiences as a kid, growing up, making the team. And I was able then to talk about my experiences of not making the grade when I was 16 and so on. And we found that we were getting this sort of mishmash of a lot of ideas, but then trying to formulate them into a story, as you mentioned, for that mid-grade of the 8s to 12s and 13-year-olds, really, that would appeal to them. But what I found was that it was almost like a filtering process that I had all this information, and then I had to think, right, how can we now best streamline this down into what will eventually become the story? But obviously, when you write fantasy, you can't do anything based on things that have happened because it's fantasy. So I'm interested in the process that you come up with ideas, if you like, and develop ideas. Do you actually base things on things that might have happened in real life that you then twist into fantasy, or is it totally new in your imagination?
I haven't. Every book is slightly different in terms of approach, but no, I haven't based anything on any real life events thus far. Nothing's really presented itself from my past that I could use. So now everything's been sort of invented whole cloth, as it were. But in terms of tone and atmosphere and certain characters or certain aspects of characters, I draw them from people and places that I've actually been to. So everything's informed by real life experience. I mean, I think every fantasy book ever written is informed in some way by things that people have actually been through. But no, nothing that I've taken sort of wholesale from my life and imported into the book particularly. The one example I sometimes give is there's a character in my book called Fletch, who's a troll, who's in fact the first troll that we meet right at the start of the book, and he's quite an elderly, sort of irascible, grumpy engineer, very worldly wise and quite impatient with Susie the heroine. and he's not, in terms of personality, he's not a perfect match, but he's drawn from our old school caretaker in Newport, where I grew up, the primary school. We had a caretaker who was an ex-miner from up Blaenavon, I think it was. And it was like he'd always been there, because for as long as any of us had been in the school, he had been there, and he was ancient, and he had like a very lined, interesting face, and scars and burn marks, and he was missing fingers, and he was hunched. And I remember that he got brought in. I'm not sure why it happened. He got brought into our class one day to just tell us about himself. And he basically just went through this catalogue of scars and missing fingers and broken bones, and it was all accidents from the mines. You know, we'd been caught in a cave-in, and another time a bit of machinery had fallen down the shaft and taken off 2 of his fingers. And there was this time the lamp went up and set fire to the side of his head. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, you're just a fascinating man. But he was just the caretaker. He sort of shuffled around, and he swept the schoolyard, and he mopped up the vomit from from the assembly hall and things, and he never really spoke to us, and we never spoke to him. He was just always around. And I remember sort of sitting thinking, all of this time you've been here, and you've had this whole life that's completely different to any experience that we've had. So he informed Fletch, one of my characters. And Trollville, which is the capital city of the Trolls, is sort of quite more deliberately informed by Newport, where I grew up, and other sort of post-industrial cities that I've spent some time in, places like Sheffield and Glasgow and things like that, where it's really quite astonishing, big-scale civic architecture, and a really, really wonderful, vibrant place that has you can tell has a very storied and quite sort of dirty, hard-working past that's now sort of fading, and it's trying to reinvent itself and find a way forward. So everything has a touchstone somewhere, I would say.
I agree. I remember years ago, obviously living in Swansea, whenever we want to go out of Wales, we pass British Steel Port Talbot. And I remember as a kid almost being drawn to it, looking out the window and the light, especially at dark if we were coming back. And it was years later that I found that Ridley Scott, when he wrote Blade Runner, or the screenplay for Blade Runner, and the film obviously after, he based the city on what he used to see in Port Talbot, because his family would always take him to West Wales a couple of times a year on holiday.
Right.
That's a futuristic story, obviously, and became one of the biggest films in history, really. And yet, a young boy simply saw it passing a couple of times a year on his holidays. So, and again, going back to my experiences writing with James with the rugby book, it's been lovely to talk about silly little things like dressing rooms we remember as kids. So James would have played rugby on the biggest stadiums in the world, Twickenham and Millennium Stadium. But we talked about the old-fashioned little Victorian sort of changing rooms in the middle of parks. Sadly, a lot of them are going now, but you'd only have sort of one working shower, and that was cold. And what we decided, we were going to try and get across how we felt as youngsters playing sport. That feeling of, it's just our time at the moment, but these have been used for like 90 years, 100 years. And all the little kinks in the cement, and where the studs have made little pockmark holes and all that stuff. And when I write, I try to bring in that sort of side of it, not just rugby match, someone wins, someone loses, someone scores a try, someone goes home happy. I really like telling that story that surrounds it all, because I think a lot of us, we do look at that detail. We do look at something as simple as like I said, a Victorian built dressing room or changing room, whatever you want to call it, in a park that's always been there. But how many people really sit down and start to describe it? So it was nice, really, that even though James is 20 years younger than me, we share those same sorts of things. And what we tried to do was use a lot of his knowledge of being a top class rugby player, but we might describe a try he might have scored for Wales, but actually put that try then into a kids game, because ultimately it's still a game of rugby. So people that will know James's career will recognise when we write some of the. There's not. I think we try and feature 2 or 3 rugby games in the book because I didn't want it just to be rugby match, rugby match, rugby match. But when some of the tries are scored, it's literally through talking to James about this certain try he scored in a certain game, me finding it on YouTube, having a little look at it, and then just dropping it into a kid's rugby match when they're 10 years of age. So, yeah, it's a nice thing. And as a writer for me then, I suppose I've always got something to look at, and that's, I find my challenge is I want to make it realistic to that 10-year-old rugby playing boy or girl that they're reading it thinking, oh, yeah, I did that last week, rather than, oh, that doesn't make sense. The way that he's described how you hold the ball or you kicked it, that doesn't make sense. So my challenge, I think, is to get it very accurate, but whilst keeping that nice storyline going through it as well.
It's all world building, isn't it?
Yes.
It's all making it feel grounded and realistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned sort of rugby playing boy or girl, and one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, what's the reception for the books been like in school, and particularly along sort of the gender divide? Because we're always told that boys aren't reading enough, and I imagine that sport must be a fantastic hook to get them interested where they might not have been previously.
Yeah, absolutely. The only reason I ended up going into schools, this is 10 years ago, was that after the first book I wrote, which was the autobiography with Tony Cottee, I ended up writing or ghosting his cricket column in the Evening Post for, I think it was 7 summers we did it. And then one of the journalists there had a friend who was a teacher and said, look, would you two guys mind coming in to talk about your book? We got a group of disengaged boys who were year 10, I think. It was a little bit daunting. We assumed that it would all be set up for us, but they literally opened the door, introduced us, and then let us crack on. So it was kill or cure, really.
Yeah, I love it when that happens.
Yeah, exactly. But honestly, it was the best 2 hours of my life. I absolutely loved it because I felt there was a genuine connection with it. But the slight issue I had was that I got 2 daughters. So I didn't like the idea that I was only potentially going to be talking to boys about sport, because that's the old-fashioned stereotype, isn't it? Now, my youngest daughter in particular was very talented in school, in primary school, at running. She was extremely quick, almost quicker than most of the other boys. Now, I'd always had sort of heroines, I guess, in sport. One of the first ones, show my age now, in 1972, was a lady in the Olympics called Mary Peters from Northern Ireland. She won the gold medal in the decathlon, or the mixed events. And Jess Ennis, who you may know in recent years, has kind of been the poster girl of the 2012 Olympics.
Yeah.
So I always felt there's a real mistake made if we just focus on sport equals boys. And especially now with the pathways in professional sport for girls to be professional footballers, be professional rugby players, cricketers, and so on, they can make a really good career playing sport. So, and again, going back to the bit that I've done with James Hook, we talked about having a really strong female character in the book. And we kind of based it a little bit on my experience of my daughter being the quickest girl in the school. Jess Ennis, who became the Olympic gold medalist, you've got to think at 16, she was probably the quickest human of her age group in England, I guess. So why can't girls come across that divide, And then what I found when I was going into schools was that I'd often be told by the teachers, oh, look, the class you're going in today, there's more girls than boys. And I think, that's fine, that's great. And whether it's the way I'm enthusiastic about it, I don't know. But the number of times girls have come up to me at the end and they say, oh, dear, we loved that today. We didn't think we were going to enjoy it. And I think it's this thing again about me, because I'm so enthusiastic about sport, and I'm not there to tell them you must like sport. But I think they just pick something up from it. And I do lots of writing exercises when I go in as well. And some of the stories and I say to them, I said, so you've never really followed sport before, but you've just written a story like that. Oh yeah, we love it. The flip side again, though, is that you do grab the boys at the same time. Because so many of the boys, I think there's a stat somewhere I read years ago that 75% of boys will take part in some active sport of some description. So they may be captain of the school team, they may just enjoy PE, it kind of doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So that's a big audience, really, that if you can appeal to them, then you're hooking them, obviously. So that's all I try and do, really. I try and obviously the books I write are sporting books, so I fully understand there'll be a market that I'll never reach because some people won't touch sport, and I get that. But I've been really, really surprised over the last 10 years how something that was probably designed for me to go in just to talk to boys has actually gone across the gender gap, you know. And I've got to the stage now that, you know, if a school got in touch and said, look, you know, you will only speak to boys, I say, well, of course I'll come in, but please don't think that's all I'm about, because it is about the message for boys and girls. And I love that. I really enjoy sort of spreading that enthusiasm I have for sport. And it's up to them then, isn't it? They'll either decide to read one of the books or take up sport or not, you know. Yeah. So yeah, it seems to work anyway.
Oh, fantastic! Well, that's really encouraging to hear. Actually, I'm quite glad that some of the old divides do seem to be breaking down, which is really good news.
Yeah, and the same sort of with yourself, I suppose. Do you ever find that with fantasy, is that like a hard sell to some children? Are they like, no, I don't like fantasy, I only like realistic? Or do you find that everybody will buy into fantasy?
Fantasy is one of those wonderfully broad genres where it can encompass all sorts of different styles and tones and things. Yeah. And it does, especially at that age, it does seem to capture most children. I mean, there will always be some readers who just never gravitate towards it, and that's absolutely fine. Just as you and I, both grew up, with our own particular favourites and things. But no, one of the things that once I got an agent, I learned an awful lot about my own writing that I never knew, because when I'd written the first draft of my first book, The Train to Impossible Places, I didn't know what sort of age range it was actually written for, because my son was about 5 or 6 at the time. Yeah. And I knew when I'd written the book that I'd sort of aged the story up slightly, but I didn't know where to. And my agent sort of took one look at it and went, "This is middle grade." I'd never heard of middle grade before. So I said, "Okay, what's that?" She said, "Right, it's sort of 7 to 12-year-olds, and that's good, because there's not enough stuff in this sort of category in that age range at the moment." Yeah. She also liked the fact that I'd written a female protagonist. Yeah. In what's otherwise, I suppose in the old days it would have been called a sort of boy's own adventure, because it's all high speed on this runaway train from one crazy world to another, and there's monsters and there's explosions and there's magic and all sorts of weird and wonderful things happening. So it had a sort of what they would say a universal appeal to boys and girls. I think the thinking still tends to be in the publishing industry, female character is going to appeal to girls most. But certainly when it comes to parents who are buying the books. But great big runaway steam train, that's more of a boy thing. So having the two in the same story sort of hits the sweet spot where those two perceptions at least overlap. And I have to say, I've having visited sort of a lot of schools and libraries and reading groups and things, it seems to be it seems to cut across both groups pretty equally. I get letters from boys and girls pretty much equally, which is lovely.
Yeah, it is lovely. And it's going back to what I said earlier, I think, about this sort of becoming a writer later in life. It sounds a bit corny, but it's a privilege, when I go into schools, I come home and I say to my wife, "How was your day?" And I just can't take the smile off my face, because it's such a genuine privilege to share your passion for a start, hopefully inspire them to embrace reading. That's the kind of thing I look at. We do writing exercises, but my belief is if you can inspire them to pick up a book or a magazine or whatever it might be and just start that journey of reading, it's a delight. And it's such a pleasure to be able to have that sort of instant impact. When you're standing in front of a class, you're talking, and then all of a sudden the questions come and you think, yeah, I've got them. It's brilliant. And it's just a joy, really, and I never, going back to the start of the conversation, really, I suppose if we were having this conversation 10 years ago after my first book, and you'd have said to me, well, where do you see your career going? I probably would have said journalism. I'd love to be a sports journalist, write serious sports books and, win the William Hill Sports Book of the Year, blah, blah, blah. But now, seeing the impact, and again, working with James on this book, we've even though the book isn't out yet, we've been into schools reading out the first chapter to children, and they love it. They literally hang on every word. So I'd have to say that even though my passion has been kind of serious sport, if that makes sense, the children's writing of sports stories is an absolute delight. It's like something I never thought I would do, and I guess now, if you ask me, I'd probably say I will always hope to write autobiographies, that sort of thing, with other sports people, because I like that. But the thought that I could potentially write, I don't know, a children's book a year for the next 10 years is an absolute delight. And I kind of hope that continues, really.
Yes. Oh no, likewise. I'm having far more fun as a writer now than I ever imagined that I would.
Yeah.
When I was trying to be sort of dark and brooding and again serious.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that being a children's author, I think part of the privilege is that we have far more contact and access to our readership than a lot of authors tend to. Because we get to go into the schools, we get to visit the libraries and things, and have these face-to-face interactions, and our readership are quite direct and unpretentious, and they will tell us what they like and what they don't like.
Yeah. And it's like that moment, isn't it, where I think a lot of people might think writers, authors have a bit of an ego. And I'd say, yeah, come to me to a classroom when you're doing your thing and a kid puts their hand up and you say, yeah, how old are you?
Yeah.
Well, how old do you think then? Well, you look a bit like my grandpa. And I'd say, right, how old's your grandpa? Well, he's 74. So where do you go, you know? So, yeah, and you are right. I never thought of it that way, really. I suppose unless as an adult author, or an author for adults, you kind of attend sort of book readings. I guess people who aren't children's authors don't get the opportunity to stand in front of their audience for a day or a half day and talk to them about it, really. And I'm sure you do the same, but I get so many ideas back from the kids as well. You know,
yes.
You know, and I'll say, right, I'm writing this book. It's about rugby. What do you think? I got this character. What do you think? And then they just come back with ideas, and it's brilliant. And, you know, hopefully they go away thinking that they contributed something to an author who's going to then possibly put it in the book.
That's it. Whenever I visit a school, I'll have an interactive bit in the middle where I actually invite the children to come up with ideas for a new magical train that could fit into one of my adventures. And they come up with stuff that I wish I'd invented. They have some brilliant ideas. And they never stop. Once they start, they want to keep going, which is fantastic. And then sometimes we carry that over into a workshop or something afterwards. But I've done a couple of events at the Postal Museum in London.
Oh, right.
Because my books are set on a postal train that delivers letters from world to world. So the Postal Museum is set underneath the sorting office in Mount Pleasant, which is the biggest sorting office in central London, and they have their own tiny underground, say tiny, it runs for miles, underground railway that they use. It's called Mail Rail, that they used to deliver letters across London, and they've reopened it as a museum now, and you can actually ride through some of the tunnels. So my publisher Usborne have organised a couple of events with me there, because it's right around the corner from their offices. And I remember sitting down at a table with a family and a couple of kids, and we were colouring in troll ears from one of the characters in my book that we're going to cut out and they could wear as a hat. And I remember thinking, well, we were just chatting about the book and the story and how it came up with the characters and the sort of books that they enjoyed reading. And I remember sitting there thinking, Salman Rushdie doesn't get to do this, does he?
Oh, exactly.
Where's the Will Self colouring activity sheet?
Yeah.
None of the none of the adult authors get to do stuff like this. So I feel remarkably lucky to be where I am.
Yeah, and it's like, obviously today we're talking for the Pontypridd Children's Festival, Literacy Festival, and it's things like that as well, isn't it? You know, it's lovely to think that there are other organisations out there that understand the importance of children's literature, because I'm pretty sure, you know, if you went back 10 or 15 years, there would have been an idea that you have author A, author B, and author B is the children's author, so therefore they're not as revered as author A. And I used to get annoyed at that even before I wrote children's books, because ultimately without children's books, it's unlikely that child who becomes the adult will have the reading journey to potentially become an author if that's what they end up doing. So I'm passionate about it. And it's been great to have this opportunity to talk to you, because we are from such different sort of writing genres. It's great to hear your sort of story as well, and it started to make me think maybe there's a fantasy sports novel in me somewhere down the line.
Yes, no, why not? I don't think I've ever actually come across a fantasy sports novel. So I think definite gap in the market. Fantasy. If you don't call it fantasy football, then of course, hand back your writer's card. It's
brilliant.
Well, Dave, I think we've been going for about close to 45 minutes now. So I think it's time to wrap it up. But it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. And hopefully, once the lockdown's over, we'll actually get a chance to sort of meet up in the flesh at some point. That'd be fantastic.
The one thing all writers of any background have got in common, we all like coffee. So,
yes.
So I think we definitely have to meet up for a coffee sometime.
That sounds brilliant.
Okay.
Anyway, all the best, Dave. I'll speak to you again soon.
Take care, Pete. All the best.
Cheers. Bye-bye now.
Bye. Bye.
Well, that was really good. Thank you.